Hello, it's Joe, the CRM chap here, and today we're going to be talking all about project service automation. We're going to show you how you can get set up for success when using the application. So first of all, we're going to look at what are the key adoption challenges when it comes to PSA, why people and organizations might find it difficult getting into PSA for the first time. And then we're then going to jump in and go through sort of in a fairly logical order the various things that you need to get set up in your PSA environment, when you're getting started for the first time. So we're going to look at things such as currencies, transaction categories, time units. We're going to spend time looking about how you set each of these up, linking to some demonstrations of the application itself so you can get a good idea in terms of how you can do that. Then finally, we'll close things out by looking at, okay, well, what's next? I've got everything set up within PSA. What can I now do to start using the application and getting some benefit from it? And we'll link to some appropriate resources around that as well. So a little bit about me on the slide here. So I work for a small Microsoft Gold Partner practice based in the UK. I've been working with Dynamics 365, Dynamics CRM for about 5 years in total. I come at it more from a technical standpoint, so I do a lot of work, for example, these days with Azure, looking at tools such as Power Automate, Power BI, C# developer, like a bit of SQL as well. For my sins, I'm also a Prince 2 Agile practitioner and a certified Scrum Master. I'm also involved as part of the Dynamics 365 user group in the northwest of England. We have meetings fairly regularly across the year, so if you are interested and are in the area at all, then be sure to check us out in the future. Okay, so when we're looking at PSA for the first time, it's got a lot of really great things going from it. It's arguably a very capable and effective solution if you're looking to manage your project delivery and alongside that use tools that project managers are most familiar with. So for example, Microsoft Project, using things such as integrated with Outlook and things like that, you've got that integration there. What I would say though is that there are a few issues. So for example, documentation for the product is a bit of a nightmare. If you spend any length of time on the Microsoft Docs website, you'll see that there's references to older versions of the product. There's not a very sort of consistently format in terms of, okay, this is how you get started. Here's a getting started guide, for example. In terms of other issues, at the moment, it very much feels like it's got what I would term a shaky development roadmap. It is eventually going to be replaced by something else in the future, a brand new project application. But what that does mean is that, okay, well, if you are using an earlier version of PSA or you're wanting to eventually transition to that new product, you are going to need to be using PSA version 3 in some shape or format. And we've already seen a bit of a preview in terms of how the new experience will look. We've got the brand new project for the web. Again, there's an issue with that in that, okay, well, where does that sit alongside PSA? If you look underneath the hood, it's using a lot of the same components and features, but it is at the moment a separate application, and potentially one that you don't even want to touch because of where it's storing the data ultimately on your tenant. So what this also comes down into is that, and certainly the issue that I found when looking at PSA for the first time is, okay, just show me show me what to do in order, show me what I need to do in a logical order to get things set up for the first time. And I can't be the only one potentially who's experiencing that, and it is potentially, I feel, a blocker for those looking to adopt the product. And it basically means that, all this good work, this great system that could, really drive some benefits in your organization is either just being ignored, not being used, or perhaps worst of all, it's being poorly implemented and therefore getting a bad rep as a consequence. So what we want to do as part of today's session is to try and get around some of these issues. I want to sort of talk through and guide how your typical Dynamics 365 administrator or consultant can get started with PSA and explain it in very sort of high level, plain English. Okay, this is what you must do in order. As part of this, we're going to educate you on some of the core entities that PSA uses out of the box. And hopefully, as part of this, we can try and provide a good reference point for you if you are thinking about adopting PSA or you're going to be involved in deployments as part of the future, as in the very near future. So we will be hands-on. We'll be jumping out into demos fairly frequently, and it is worth just saying that we're not going to be covering the topics that I highlight on this slide here. So we're not going to be diving into deep, for example, around the actual project delivery process. We're not going to be looking at unified resource scheduling, for example. Those would potentially are something for could be devoted to a whole session in of itself potentially. Okay, so to get started, first of all, so you want to get set up with PSA for the first time. That's great. First of all, make sure that you've got a current version of PSA at your disposal, installed in an environment or on your tenant. By current version, I mean version 3, not version 2. Um, when you're experimenting around for the first time, it is very much recommended that you set up either a sandbox or a trial so that you can just do things safely and not break things. Trials can be set up very easily using the URL below. So, again, just give yourself enough headroom to be able to experiment with this and, not necessarily start touching or affecting your production data around that. So you've deployed your PSA environment for the first time. The next step is to start setting up these various entities, and these are all arguably configuration type tasks. You're not having to go in and customize the system when doing this up. It's literally just a case of, in most circumstances, setting up a record, setting up a transaction category record or a resource record, etc. And it's also worth highlighting that some of these are actually optional. You don't need to follow all of these in order. We'll sort of touch on and explain, okay, why you might want to consider setting, for example, time units up and what benefit they serve you by doing so. So first of all then, for those who are familiar with working with Dynamics 365 sales, currencies and exchange units should be fairly familiar. They are effectively, pointers in the application to basically for reporting to indicate, okay, here are the different currencies that we are transacting with our customers across the entire organization, or even globally perhaps. So when you're setting up a Dynamics 365 instance for the first time, there's always going to be a default currency that you have to select as part of that. What you can then do, and what PSA supports the ability to, is then add on additional currencies. So let's say that your base currency is in pound sterling. You want to also transact into euro and US dollars. You would then go in and install those additional currencies on top of the base currency, your pound sterling. Then, in order to make sure that things get translated across appropriately for reporting purposes, you'd set up an exchange rate. And then so that when I'm running a report as a user based off my pound sterling, I get the appropriate or approximate exchange rate applied as part of that for each of the individual currencies that are being factored in. So really what you want to be doing up front is sort of having a good hard think, and if you know you're going to be using 3, 4 or 10 different currencies, perhaps not maybe immediately, but further down the line, get those set up and installed early on so that you're not having to go back in later on and worry about adding them on and doing all the setup steps around it and things. So currencies can be set up rather easily. At the moment, it's one of these things that you have to go into the classic interface to set up. So you go into business management currencies, and then you just add on any additional currencies that you need as part of that. It's very straightforward, and we're going to see right now how straightforward it is. Okay, so we jumped across into our project service environment. We're in the brand spanking new unified interface, but we don't care about that because we're going to be going into the classic, into advanced settings. This is where we define our various currencies. So we're going to click on currencies down here. We can see straight away we've got pound sterling set up as as our default base currency. So we're just going to add on a few more that we're going to use across the entire demonstration. So first of all, we're going to add in our Swiss franken, Schweizer franken, that should be. Just make up a fictional currency conversion rate. We typically would want to check this and be updating it fairly regularly based on fluctuations. So click save and close on there. And then let's go slightly more further afield now. Let's say maybe to Japan or something. What else have we got here? Yeah, so we're going to do the Japanese yen as well. And again, we'll make this one a little bit higher again. I don't know if that's accurate or not. And it's literally just as simple as that in terms of adding our currencies in. So now we've got as our base currency our pound sterling, and we can also now transact in this organization using our Schweizer franken and our Japanese yen. Okay, so with your currencies set up and ready to go, now you need to give some consideration in terms of your invoice frequency. And this will typically vary based on the organization you're working with. It could even differ based on, in an organization itself. Typically, most businesses will have a fairly set period in when they invoice their customers. It'll either be at the month end, they'll have maybe every Thursday will be the day where they raise invoices, for example. The great thing about PSA is that it gives you the ability to automatically trigger when these invoices get generated automatically, and you do this by specifying an invoice frequency. Now, the thing to just raise and just be clear on when it comes to invoices in the application with PSA is that they're not designed to generate your customer-facing invoice documents. They're more just designed as pointers in the application to show you, okay, this is what you then need to go into your Xero, Sage, or Business Central system to then invoice the customer directly. but they can be quite useful in helping to automate some of the steps as well. So typically you would specify these at your quote line detail level, ideally at quote or project contract stage. And you've got the ability of being able to specify monthly, bi-weekly, or weekly, and then some additional options underneath there to then fine-tune the frequency around that, which is really good. And in terms of setting those up, then what you would do is that you would go into the PSA app, into your settings area, and then from there they're just records that you set up in there. And once they're set up and ready to go, you can then save the record for the first time, go in, and then in this case we want to say, okay, on the first day of the month is when we invoice people. Or if indeed I wanted to change that, maybe I wanted to do it based on, okay, the second or third, Wednesday each month, or in this case the first Friday each month. Again, you can do that, and you can add on as many of these different occurrences as you need in order to get things up and running. So let's see how we do that now in the application. Okay, we're back in the PSA app now, and instead of going into the classic interface this time around, we're going to jump into the settings area down here. And as we can see, we've got the option here for our invoice frequency. So we're just going to set up just a very simple basic one that's going to cover what we need. So we're just going to call this our test frequency. We want to generate the invoices every week, so we select weekly on that. We can see the form automatically just updates based on what we've supplied. It's also saved the record at this point. And by default, what it's done is it's basically specified Monday as our weekday, but we can actually change this if we want to. We can go into here, and then we can maybe just change it to, let's say, Thursday instead. Do save and close. Alternatively, we can also maybe look at adding in, a completely different invoice frequency. So maybe we want to do something that's based on a sort of more based on, let's say, a specific day period. Let's say. So we'll do a day period example as this one. We're going to leave this as monthly, and we're going to say this is running 3 times per month. So again, it saved the record for us at this particular point, and if we go into here, we can see we've actually got 3 records that the system has spit out for us automatically. And then we can just go in and just tinker about with this, maybe change it to 14 in this case, and do what we need to do to get things set up. And that is how you get started with invoice frequencies in PSA. Next then, we need to start thinking about our transaction categories. And these can be best defined as effectively just a group of a top level category for different things that you may end up expensing within your organization. So whether it's sort of travel, whether it's sort of meals or food, or hotel costs or things like that, you've got the ability of being able to specify any number of different type of transaction categories as may be required for your particular needs. And the key thing that you can do without this, as part of this, is then dictate, okay, is this something that we're going to be charging the customers? Is it something that we just take the hit on, either in terms of it being a non-chargeable or complimentary, and we can even just mark it as not being available at all. So this might be useful if down the line you decide you don't want to actually use it anymore. And the good thing as well is that it also incorporates and can be used alongside your units and unit groups. So again, this is another out-of-the-box Dynamics 365 feature. So you can define custom unit groups that then correspond across back to your transaction categories. So again, this is something that you set up within the settings area of the application. You go into transaction categories, and then in this case, we're just setting up a meal transaction category. So let's have a take a look now how we do that in the application. So once again, this is something that we can do within the new interface. You don't have to jump out into Classic. So all we do is just go down into Settings down here. We select our transaction categories entity down here. When PSA ships and is deployed for the first time in your environment, you can see you've got a default transaction category set up in there. You can probably just leave that as it is, so and set up just the ones that you need. So we're going to maybe just set up one for, let's say, hotels, or we'll call, actually, accommodations, probably a bit more script on there. We're going to see if we've got a unit group, so we're just going to say default unit for all of this, default unit group and primary unit. And we're going to say that this is a non-chargeable. This is something that we want to just sort of take on the chin as part of the work that we're doing. Next, we're going to do something maybe where it's sort of mileage or travel. Probably it's a bit more nondescript one. So the key thing is making them just as nondescript as possible, really, so you can group other expense categories underneath them later on. So again, we just add on default unit. If the units that we set up are insufficient, we can actually go in and change those if we need to. And in this case, we're going to say this is something that's chargeable. So any expense categories that sits underneath this is going to be something that ultimately is factored in as part of our cost back to the customer. And at this point, we just go and we can add more if we need to, but that should probably just be sufficient for now in terms of the transaction categories that we need. So at this point, we've set up our top level transaction categories. Now we need to define what sits underneath that, our specific expensible categories. And these will be the ones that the users ultimately have the ability of being able to select within the application when they're filling in their expenses or things like that. You must make sure that they are related to a transaction category. That's non-negotiable there. You can also specify options such as, okay, I want people to make sure they always provide a receipt when they're submitting this. That's probably quite a very essential step that I'd always probably recommend organizations have. With any expense, receipts will always become useful. And what Microsoft do say, they recommend that, if you're a little bit unsure in terms of what you need to set up from an expense category point of view, then the ones listed here on the slide are probably going to cover most of your scenarios. You can then go on and then maybe just take out any that aren't applicable or add on any that you need on top of it. So in terms of setting that up, then we then go again into the settings area of the application, and then we just create that in there and assign it back to our transaction category. So again, let's jump in now and see how we do that in the application. So as we saw earlier in the application, we set up a transaction category that covers off our travel, any sort of travel type expense that we want to do. So we're going to sort of build on this a little bit further. We're going to build out a couple of expense categories that sit underneath the travel one, just for the purpose of this demo. You'd obviously, if you're setting this up more fully, you'd go in and set up everything that you need instead. But for now, we're just going to do a new expense category. We'll call this one mileage. So this is when we're sort of on the road and we need to expense back the details to the client. We're going to call it mileage as the expense type in there. We're going to associate it to our travel category over there, and we're going to say on this one that we actually want a receipt on this one. It's really important that we get that through. Next on here, we're just going to call this, let's say, our air travel, let's say. So again, just call that airline. Travel again, and then, yeah, we're just going to say, again, mandatory receipt on there. So we could just keep doing this all day. You probably get the idea now in terms of what you're doing. So you just start to go in, you build them out. You ideally try and align them against an appropriate expense type that Microsoft have provided on here. Potentially something that you can customize if you need to, but those should probably cover most of your needs for when you build out your expense categories. Okay, so moving on now. Typically, most organizations, when they're billing resources or things like that, they'll typically do it either based on a sort of a daily or an hourly based equation rate or something like that. And for most organizations, that will suit the requirements. If you need to go a little bit more specific underneath that, maybe you want to split things off based on maybe quarters of days, or maybe 2 days or 3 days, as a combined sort of unit. Then what you can do again is leverage the unit group and unit functionality within the application. And as part of that, you can then further fine tune the various time units that are available within the application. Now, by default, when PSA is installed for the first time, you get an hour and a day time unit, which corresponds to the figures on there. And again, that might be suitable for most situations that you need. But again, the great thing about this is you can go on, you can add on additional ones if you need to. So so in terms of how we do this in the application, we jump into the advanced settings area. We need to go into our product catalog, and underneath there we'll see unit groups and then units underneath there. And again, we can just go in there and customize that further if we need to. Add on additional units underneath that. So you customize your unit group, and again, add half days, quarter days, etc. underneath that. So again, let's jump in and see how we do that in the application. Picking up then on what we just mentioned around having maybe a quarter or half days for our time units, we're going to go in now and we're going to set up something similar within PSA. So this is something, as we see, we need to go into the classic interface for. So we just go to advanced settings at the top. This will open things up in the classic interface. We then want to navigate through to our product catalog within the business area of the settings page. Then within there, we should see our unit groups area, which we can click into and then start to modify the time unit group that's been shipped by default. Okay, click on unit groups. We You see we've got our time just down there, so we're going to double click into that. We'll pop this out into a new form. This is going to open it up into the new unified interface. So you have to go into Classic to get back out into unified. So that's quite fun. But we do this so that we can then access the related tab down here. We can see our units. So at the moment we've got, let's say, hourly, which is defined as our one on there. So we're going to say maybe that, okay, so an 8-hour day is what we assume as part of that. So let's just add in, let's say, a half day. And we're going to give that a quantity of 4. With our base unit being an hour. And again, we're just going to then add on a whole day. So a whole day on here. Again, the quantity of this will be 8. And we're going to base that off our hour again. So again, we can go through, we can maybe do it in maybe blocks of 2 hours. It really just depends in terms of how we want to build things out, whether we want to go down purely based on hours, or if we want to start bundling things up from there. The great thing is, because we're using the units and unit group and unit functionality, which is built in the application, we can get going with this and set this up really easily. So before we move on and have a look at resources in detail, it is just worth mentioning quickly that, and as we discussed earlier, the product catalog is supported for use alongside project service automation. So, if you are in a situation where, let's say, you're selling products on top of, maybe consultancy services or things like that, you can very easily bring this across into PSA. It is a purely optional requirement, though. It's not something that you need to potentially worry about if it's not something that your organization is doing. And it's something that is potentially quite in depth. It's typically something that if you're setting up the sales module for the first time, you'll be quite familiar with. So we're not going to discuss it really in too much detail as part of this particular video today. This diagram is really probably, it's been around I think for about nearly 10-15 years now. It really nicely summarizes the entire process from start to finish in terms of what you need to do. So by all means, go off if you think you're going to need this for your PSA deployment, then it is here, and here's how you can go about setting it up. Okay, so resources. So these are probably arguably the main component within the application. They are effectively the individuals or pieces of equipment, or other core items within our organization that are delivering our projects for us. And more crucially, are the things that we want to get booked out as well within our projects. Now, it's not just a case that you set up the resource itself and then it's job done. There's quite a few steps before that you need to go through in order to sort of make sure the resource has been decorated with all the appropriate definitions and characteristics. So we can sort of see on this list here what they are. We're going to jump in now and take a look at each of these in a bit more detail. So characteristics, so these effectively just define, okay, me as an individual, what skills do I have, what qualifications, what certifications I have, all of this can be defined as part of our characteristic. And the great thing about this is that you can, it's not, you can also, have as many as you want in the system, and also give it some additional properties and details if you need to as well. So all you do to set them up is you go to the resource area of the PSA application, go to skills, then within there you can basically set things up, and that's job done really. So moving on, next from that is your rating models. So when we think about, let's say, skill, for example, so let's take let's say a contact center scenario, maybe where you're dealing with customers, maybe telephone manner or things like that, or maybe something like programming, maybe C# or JavaScript, something like that. Potentially you could be anywhere on the spectrum when it comes to your proficiency with that. So what rating models let you do is specify as many different levels of skill proficiency for what we've just defined a few minutes ago. So as part of this, there's a few things to remember. You need to make sure that you're defining both a minimum and maximum value for each rating that you have. You can only have one rating model in the system that has a rateable entity value of skill. So just keep that in mind when you're setting things up. And then once it's been saved, it goes off. It does some stuff for you automatically, creates some properties for you. You've also got the ability within there to also then dictate whether a rating model is default or not as well, which is quite nice. So again, this is all done from in the resources area of the application. You just go to proficiency models, and then we can see on there we've got the default rating model that ships with the application. And that's something that if you wanted to, you can tailor or just get rid of completely if it's not suitable. Next then, so typically for the resources that we've got in the organization or individuals, let's say, typically they're going to have, let's say, a job title or a role. So maybe project manager, developer, a business analyst, all this sort of stuff. And so this is where bookable resource categories come in. They let you define these roles that we can then tag onto our resources. And the great thing is that a resource can have many different roles potentially as well. So you don't necessarily have to shoehorn people into individual ones. If you need to be able to mix and match them potentially as part of different projects, then this provides a great way of you being able to do that. As part of setting them up, you define whether this is a resource that you want to actually charge to the customer and have factored into your figures. You also need to give some consideration to your target utilization in terms of, okay, well, what's your, how much do you want this resource booked out? Do you want them booked out pretty much all the time? Do you want them, your potential flags to sort of show up in the system, when a resource isn't at the target utilization level? So you specify that on the on the bookable resource category level. Okay, so for example, I want to make sure this resource is 50% utilized all the time. Then that will dictate whether you've got the red, amber, green category color will then dictate based on the formulas that are sort of written on there. And a thing to mention as well is that if you want to start tagging your characteristics to your categories, then you're going to need to make sure you save the record for the first time as well. So as you'd expect, again, this is all set up in the resources area on here. So we can see we've got an example one on here for our software engineer. And we tagged on a few different skills with different rating values as part of that on there, which is what the resource category needs. And then finally then is our resources. So this is our individual or asset or potentially group of people that are doing the work for us. So what you would typically do for individuals, you'd base them off, let's say, an internal user, a Dynamics 365 user, for example. You could also have a user have a contact record, so not necessarily a licensed user in the application as your resource. There's other options as well. You could have it maybe so it's an account record, so maybe it's an external company that's doing some work for you. You can have equipment or facility, so potentially quite useful for sort of for let's say I want to book out a room, let's say, or a particular piece of equipment to complete a particular job. Then you've got some other options such as generic crew and pool as well. Pool can be quite useful if you're working with multiple record types, multiple resource types as part of your deployment. So once you've created your resource, at that point you can then start defining the skills and roles for them. It's worth bearing in mind if you are using field service, then any resource you set up here will also feed through into that application as well. And as part of that, you can then specify, okay, what are their start end locations and also what their organizational units are as well. So the final thing to touch upon with resources is work hour templates. So when you create a resource for the first time, it's assigned the default template working pattern that's been defined in the application. So in most cases, you might need to go in and potentially override this. Let's say the resource is working, let's say flexible hours. Let's say at the moment because of COVID, let's say they're working 8 to 4, or maybe they've got holidays booked up, or they're not full-time employee. They're going to be sort of on leave or secondment for a set period. Using the work hour templates, you can go in and you can override that. And what's really great about this is that you're presented with a visual calendar view that you can then just select the various dates on there and then just add on a working pattern or add on a time off request and do all that sort of stuff. And then once you've created that for the first time for one resource, let's say you want to reuse it again in the application, you've got the ability to do that via the Save As button, which is really nice. So again, all this is done from the resource level. So we go into we create our resource first of all. So in this, for Alan's case, we've given him some skills and a job role. And then finally, we've gone on here and we've sort of defined his various his working hours, his time off and non-working, just by pressing that button at the top of the form. Okay, so appreciate there's quite a lot to go through here. So let's jump in the application now and see how we do it in action. So for the purposes of this demo, and just to keep things fairly condensed from a timing point of view, we're just going to focus on building out a single resource and the appropriate information that's needed around that. So first of all, we want to define our characteristics. So these are either our skills or our certifications for our particular resource. So first of all, to do that, we need to go into resources down here. We click on our skills tab down here. We've got some ones that have been set up already in the system. We're just going to click on new. And the first one we're going to say is, okay, we're going to define, let's say, C# programming, let's say, as our skill here, because it's not something that we can necessarily get a qualification if we want to. Although, yeah, well, yeah, you can if you want to, but yeah, for the purpose of this, we're going to pretend it's a skill. So just click save and close down there. Next, we're going to add in a certification. So in this case, we're going to call this our MB200 certification. And we're going to call this, change the characteristic type down there and click on save and close again. So again, we've got a skill and certification there that we can start to use of our resources. Next, we want to define sort of some characteristics. So for example, for our C# programming, we want to be able to tell whether somebody is actually, a beginner, intermediate, or a bit more advanced when it comes to their proficiency with that particular skill. So just to make things nice and clear and easy, it's actually accessed via proficiency models down here, as opposed to just being rating models as we've seen. We've got one that comes out of the box with PSA, but we're not really going to be too concerned with that today. In fact, we're just going to remove that, and we're going to create a brand new one from scratch. We're going to make sure that it's rateable entity based on skill, and we want to have 3 tiers to this. So we're just going to call this our software. We're going to call this our programming. Keep it generic. Programming proficiency. And we're going to click on save. Now, the great thing about this, based on what we define in these 2 fields on here, the application actually goes off and creates the appropriate records for us with each of the appropriate values. So all we need to do at this point is actually go in and just make sure that the rating label values are actually something that's useful to us. So we'll just do that quickly for each one of these. We'll call this one intermediate. We can't overwrite the values or do anything else in here. It's all basically dictated by what we've put over here, so don't be trying to sort of fiddle about too much with it. Click save and close, and we want to just by default say that our beginner one is our default one, so we'll change that to yes. We need to actually no, we'll leave it as is. Actually, we'll leave it as is. So what you would have to do in order to get around that error message is probably you would have to change this. Actually, no, you can probably change this to no, thinking about it. Yeah, so we change that. We go back onto our record up here. None of them are default at the moment, and then we can just go in and change this to yes. There we go. Nice and simple. So that's our rating model defined. Now we want to actually set up our bookable resource categories. And in this case, we want to have a role for Dynamics 365 developer with the certification and skills that we listed already. So in which case we go to roles up here. Again, by default, you get these 2 roles deployed out for every PSA instance. So your project manager role and your team members are just generic. They'll always be in there. You can tailor them further if you need to, but we're not going to pay too much attention to them today. We're going to call our role, as we said, Dynamics 365 developer. We want to say, because we want to make sure the developer's got some capacity for training and for maybe business as usual stuff. So we're just going to say target utilization for that is 60%. And we very definitely want to charge for this developer because they should hopefully be a nice little learner for us. Let's click save on that. Okay, and at this point we want to add in the skills. So not just our certification, but also the fact that, okay, yeah, it's a C# programming. And we want to say that for Dynamics 365 developer, they are intermediate in their proficiency with C# programming. And then we also add in our MB200 as well. So again, there's no, you can define a proficiency for this, but it's not required as part of a certification. So we just click save and close down there, because unless it's let's say an exam maybe, or maybe some sort of degree where maybe you've got, let's say, merit, distinction, or pass, or things like that. For most cases, certifications, you just want to not bother too much about the rating values. So with all that done, we can now actually create our resource, our individual or person who is our developer in the organization. So we're going to click on resources up here, click on new. Now, as you've seen already, we've got various options that we can set up on here. We can base it off existing records in the systems, whether it's a contact, a user, or an account. We can have it so that maybe it's an equipment record. Maybe there's, we've got a crew, some a group of developers who we just want to have booked out, at a very top level. In this case, we're just going to set generic, so that you don't have to tag it to any particular record, and we'll call this one Jane Smith as our developer. So click save. Then at this point, we can start to decorate this resource with the appropriate things that we set up already. So for example, we can go in here and say that the characteristic for Jane is that, okay, yeah, she is a C# programmer, but she's actually just a little bit more proficient. Actually, she's actually a pretty solid expert when it comes to C#. So we can actually override that compared to what the role is, and also assign a role to her. So in this case, we want to assign on the Dynamics 365 developer role, and this is her default role in the organization. And again, you can have as many different roles as you want for this, as many different skills. You can override some of the target utilization information on here as well if you want to. So again, you can make a resource, potentially very, as skilled or as diverse as you want to in order to suit, your particular strategy for how you want to get them booked out and things like that. We've got some other tabs over here where we can sort of enable settings such as whether the resource is available on the display board, their default organizational unit, all that sort of stuff. So the only other thing that we just want to take a quick look at on here is the work hour templates, just to show you how to set that up. So we can see we've got a button up here saying show work hours. When we click this, we get a really nice looking grid on here that shows us all of the different, the default working pattern for Jane across a particular month or a period. And what we can do is we can actually customize this if we want to. So we can do new working hours up here. We get a new grid up here in a sort of quick create form up here that we can sort of use. So we just want to say that over, let's say, over the period of June, over 30 days, we just want to say her working hours are all day with a capacity of 1. We've saved that on there. We can see we can customize that further. We can go in and maybe change that, maybe adjust it to maybe, let's say 5 or 6 or things like that. You've got a whole bunch of different capabilities in here that you can basically define. Okay, so maybe for one specific day I want to say, okay, this is a non-working day for Jane all day, maybe she's on holiday. So again, when I then try and book this Jane out on the calendar, it's going to show as being unavailable on there. This calendar is actually really nice. It gives you a nice new view and way of being able to book in your resources, and definitely something that you want to be using a lot more moving forward. That's how we work with resources. So if our resources are categorized in the application, now we can start thinking about actually, setting up the appropriate billing mechanism so that we can start charging and actually earning some money from them. Sounds quite bad when you say it like that, but yeah, we'll just ignore that for a second. So in order to do that, we've touched upon this already. It's the price list, and this is inheriting the same functionalities in your sales module. The only difference is that instead of having your products, although you can have them in PSA, instead, primarily you're dealing with resource price list, assigning resources to a price list and having a price for their unit of time that is being consumed around that. Now you've got 3 different types of price lists that you must that you can work with. You've got your cost price list, purchase and sale price lists. These should be fairly self-explanatory in terms of what they will do. When you set them up for the first time, you then need to go in and define your role prices. You've got the ability to then also define your markups, your various expense categories, any applicable product price list items that you want around that, and then also whether this applies to any specific territories as well. So really you want to be making sure that all of the stuff that we talked about already is set up in the application. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself going back in and out all the time trying to create your price list for the first time. So in this example slides on here, we're going to create a cost price list. We've gone into the sales area for the PSA application. We've created a cost price list that's applicable for the year, specified what our currency and our time units are around that. Then within there, we specified, okay, for our 2 roles, our robotics technician and our software engineer, their hourly rates are what's listed on the slide there, $50 and $75 a piece. And then we can add in as many of those that we want around that. If we want to then also have some category pricing around our transaction categories. So for example, we want to charge a flat rate for any sort of mileage claims or for any entertainment claims, we can define that in the application. Alternatively, we can just pass that cost straight on to the customer when we generate some invoices. Again, we've got a few flexible options around that. Again, best way to see this is to jump in and see how it does in the application itself. So if our resources are categorized in the application, now we can start thinking about actually, setting up the appropriate billing mechanism so that we can start charging and actually earning some money from them. Sounds quite bad when you say it like that, but yeah, we'll just ignore that for a second. So in order to do that, we've touched upon this already, it's the price list, and this is inheriting the same functionalities in your sales module. The only difference is that instead of having your products, although you can have them in PSA, instead, primarily you're dealing with resource price list, assigning resources to a price list and having a price for their unit of time that is being consumed around that. Now you've got three different types of price lists that you must that you can work with. You've got your cost price list, purchase and sale price lists. These should be fairly self-explanatory in terms of what they want, what they will do. When you set them up for the first time, you then need to go in and define your role prices. You've got the ability to then also define your markups, your various expense categories, any applicable product price list items that you want around that, and then also whether this applies to any specific territories as well. So really you want to be making sure that all of the stuff that we talked about already is set up in the application. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself going back in and out all the time trying to create your price list for the first time. So in this example slides on here, we're going to create a cost price list. We've gone into the sales area for the PSA application. We've created a cost price list that's applicable for the year, specified what our currency and our time units are around that. Then within there, we specified, okay, for our two roles, our robotics technician and our software engineer, their hourly rates are what's listed on the slide there, $50 and $75 a piece. And then we can add in as many of those that we want around that. If we want to then also have some category pricing around our transaction categories. So for example, we want to charge a flat rate for any sort of mileage claims or for any entertainment claims, we could define that in the application. Alternatively, we can just pass that cost straight on to the customer when we generate some invoices. Again, we've got a few flexible options around that. Again, best way to see this is to jump in and see how it does in the application itself. When it comes to price lists, then you typically want to set up two different kinds of them within PSA. You want to have your cost and then your sale price. For the purpose of the demo today, we're just going to focus on creating just one, but just keep that in mind. You want to be making sure that you keep those distinct because you want to be able to compare ultimately from a reporting standpoint, what things have actually cost you in terms of, okay, for a resource, for a salary, or, for an asset cost, etc., compared to ultimately what you're able to bill that out for. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into sales down here. We're going to click onto price lists over here. We're going to click on new. And we're just going to call this, we're just going to set this as our cost price list. So we'll call this cost price list 2020 to 2021. We'll set the date as today, for example, and then we're just going to change the year on there to 2021. So this is going to use our default currency in the system. It's also going to use our time units of hours. So we're going to build things out by hours. If you need to change that at all or have on a different time unit as part of for your requirements, then you can also change this. But at this point, we're just going to click on save. Those fields are now locked. So if you did mess up, you're going to have to go out and recreate the record again. And what we're going to do first of all, we're going to create our role prices. So we're going to go into here. So we should be able to see the role that we set up earlier. We've got our Dynamics 365 developer down here. We're going to specify the default resourcing unit for them, and we're going to say that their hourly rate is probably around, let's say, £80, let's say, per hour. So click save and close down there. If we wanted to, we can add on additional ones. So maybe if we wanted to have our project manager, for example, again, we could just go on and add those on. Maybe we just made that just a little bit more expensive. So you'd go through for every resource role that you've defined, you would go through, you would sort of define those in the role prices. If at this point it's probably not too suitable for a cost price list, but you've also got the option of being able to do your role price markups within here. We're not going to focus on creating that for the purposes it is a cost price list that I've said. And then category prices. This is where, if you recall, we've set up all these nice transaction categories and expenses and things like that. This is where we would basically go in and define those at more sort of cost level. So in this case, we're going to say what our travel cost over here. And we're going to say that this is basically a price per unit cost. So for example, we're just going to say I'm just going to have, let's say, it's probably not too suitable for this particular scenario. I'm just going to say it's going to be 150 for that. Save and close. Again, if we wanted to, there's additional ones that we can add on. Because we've not actually defined any more chargeable transaction categories in the system, they're not going to show up down there. So we're just basically just stuck with travel as our default option. And that's pretty much it for how you set up a cost price list in PSA. Okay, so the next thing we want to start thinking about is our organizational units, whether or not we want to actually make use of these or just go with the default one that's provided within the application itself. Now, these are not the same as your business units. They are a separate thing. They're used for similar ways. They kind of represent a division or an area of the business of the organization that you're working for, but they are a PSA only feature. And the purpose they serve here is being able to have it so that you can have multiple different cost price lists, being able to then, have a separate price list for, let's say, the Northwest Division, separate one for the South Division, etc. And as part of that, you've got various location-based properties that you configure around that. And similar to our user accounts in the application itself, a resource can only be assigned to one organizational unit. So just keep that in mind. You might need to end up moving the resource about if they do need to be part of different organizational units in the future. And they're set up very straightforwardly. Again, you just go into your settings area, define the name, description of it, what the base currency is. Then you can then tag on your various cost price lists that you've already set up around that. Next, from a configuration standpoint, is your project parameters. So these are best thought of as your system level settings that affect how PSA behaves in various different areas. There's only one of these records in the application, and they define all of the settings that you can possibly have in the application. So in here, you can set what your default price lists are, what your default invoice frequency records are, all this sort of stuff on here. You've also got the ability of being able to define what type of resource allocation mechanism to use as part of this. So whether you want to have it so that only managers of resources can allocate resources to a project, or whether any manager of any role can go in and just take a resource and put them out on a project. Then also additional settings as well, so just being able to work with multi-currency pricing. Amount and markup based pricing dimensions is where you would set this up. That in itself is quite a separate topic, not something we're going to be able to cover as part of today's session. But what that effectively lets you do is, based on custom entity configurations or different things that you've set up in the application, you can then have markups and amounts be applied automatically. So it's a really nice feature and one that potentially most organizations might look at if they've got some customizations involved in their system. So again, the project parameter record is in the settings area of the application. This is just an example of how it looks out of the box. But let's go in and just take a look at how that behaves in a bit more detail now. When it comes to our organizational units then and our project parameters, this is something that we have to go into the settings area to take a look at. So first of all, we'll have a look at organizational units. So you can see by default, we've got one. PSA has set one up for us with a rather garish looking name on there. So that's definitely something that as a first time actually going in, you're going to want to fix. We click into it down here, we can see that we've already had a cost price list associated to this on here. It's the one that we created earlier. We can add on additional ones as well if we want to. And then we can also look at various different properties for it, such as the latitude and longitude, and also any related records to that as well. Additional ones, we can add in as many ones that we want based on our particular structure for organization. So probably best to try and maybe mirror it alongside any sort of business unit structure that you've got in the application as well. Next, we've got our parameters on here. So if we click on over here, this defines all of the top level settings for a particular instance that we've got. So we can set, for example, okay, when I create a new project or a new sales record, okay, what's my default organizational unit? I can define the default R invoice frequency. So we're just going to choose the day period example we created earlier. Who our project manager and team member roles are, whether they want to support multi-currency cost price lists. There's a whole host of different settings on here that you can sort of tinker around with to change and things like that. And this will affect how things operate in the application. You put in your various price lists on here if you define them. So whether they're sort of either your cost or perhaps maybe your sales price lists. You can start doing things such as amount-based pricing dimensions where you start to tag on different fields or entities as part of your calculations. So the setup for that is a bit more complicated, probably beyond the scope for this session, but from here is where you would basically define those. There's a whole range of different things that you can do. So you'll typically want to go in, review the project parameter record, and just tailor about the various different settings to suit your particular needs. So that's how you work with organization units and project parameters in PSA. So that pretty much wraps it up for today's video. What I did want to sort of leave you with is a couple of sort of, action steps of things that you probably need to start thinking about after you've basically been through all of the setup that we've been through today. So first of all, you need to give some consideration around the out-of-the-box PSA sales process. And as part of that, do an analysis to make sure that it's fit for your particular purposes. A key thing around that is making sure that you fully understand how the out-of-the-box sales module, sales entities, so your opportunities, quotes, and orders, how they behave compared and how they differ from the default sales module. There are some important differences. So, for example, in PSA, you would typically have one opportunity and then many quotes underneath that, and each quote would be a different iteration of your, best gut feeling project plan. So again, understand that and make sure that you do the necessary tailoring around that to suit your particular needs. Moving on from that, consider how you can use project templates to help automate and simplify things. You're not necessarily having to reinvent the wheel each time that you're doing the same project over and over again. Consider how the Microsoft Project Desktop app fits into the equation, whether you need to start deploying out the project add-in and the appropriate scaffolding around that. Think about how the project delivery process works out of the box in the application, how this relates to the sales process, how project contracts fit into the bill as part of this. Then when you're thinking about your resources, you're going to need to make a decision in terms of how you're going to be booking out your resources, whether you do soft or hard bookings. Consider how people are going to be entering their time entries as they're recording for their recording progress against their appropriate tasks. And then finally, you need to have a good understanding as well in terms of how your actuals are generated in the application and how these can be potentially overridden as part of your journal entries. So what I will say is that this list is not exhaustive. There's a lot of other things you need to think about, and indeed a lot of these could also be the topic of their own sessions in themselves. So if that is something that you are interested in, you want to have see a video or a future session on this, then do please let me know, and I can maybe look at putting something together for that. So at this point, or at least is just recommend a couple of resources to go and have a look at. So I mentioned the Microsoft Docs website already. They have got a lot of different articles and information points on there to help get your head around PSA. It does suffer for some of the issues that I mentioned already. So that's where potentially other resources come into play. So Anti's blog and YouTube channel, if you've done anything to do with PSA, this really, probably doesn't even deserve a mention, but, he is the god, the supremo when it comes to PSA. A lot of good resources on there to help you get your head around how PSA, the various different quirks, how it sort of behaves and things like that. Another potentially good resource and one that came out fairly recently is Guldeep Gupta's Getting Started with Dynamics 365 PSA version 3 video. Covers some of the same sort of stuff that we've talked about today, but shows you in practice how to get things set up. So I would recommend you check that out. And then finally, because of how quickly things are changing with PSA, and what the potential future holds for the product, it is worth being aware of what the roadmap is and getting yourself ready and prepared for what's going to be happening in the future. But certainly, it's a little bit uncertain at the moment what's going to be happening. What I would say is that being on PSA version 3 at the moment, as a sort of minimum checkbox, is going to help you out. It's going to make it that future transition across to the new project operations a whole lot more easier potentially. Okay, so I hope this video has been really useful. My contact details on the slide here. If you've got any questions at all, leave them in the comments below. Like and subscribe to the channel. Try and do videos fairly regularly across a whole different plethora of different topics to do with Dynamics 365. So yeah, thanks for listening and take care.